Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Aero League Racing Tier 1. My name is Aman, and I'll be doing commentary for you today. We've got an exciting race in store for you all as we head to Singapore. A long race, that's for sure. 31 laps around the street circuit. But, of course, it's one of the longer races on the F1 calendar that we have for this season. So it's safe to say that we're going to be here for a little bit of a while. So until then, everybody should just probably get comfortable. We will be beginning very, very soon, as I think we've almost got a full grid now. And while we have the chance, after the first race of the season, let's review these standings. So at this current moment, ladies and gentlemen, Paul House or Mitchell leads the championship with 25 points, followed by Big Bambino in P2 and the Williams with 18, BR4 in P3, Stell in P4, you have Steba in P5, Jaguar in P6, Ella in P7, Trucker in P8, and Pyro in P9, and Jacko in P10. So everything to play for. It's still early on in the season, so it's safe to say that we will have a ton. This order will definitely switch around as we progress through the season. So just a few more moments now until we get started. So be sure you all get comfortable, get something to drink, maybe grab the loved one, and yeah, we should be getting started very, very soon. Hello, Nocturne. Hope you're doing well. Thank you for tuning into the stream as always. I'm very surprised Saeed hasn't dropped in as yet. You're only here to see what poll time is? Yeah, I can't blame you for that. We do have a very exciting race in store, so if you want to stick around for that, you're more than welcome to, of course. Right then, ladies and gentlemen, we've gotten the go-ahead from Pyro, who has had to set up this lobby this time around. So we are all set to get the Singapore Grand Prix underway. Of course, let's talk about this track a little bit. A street circuit, of course, and it is a very, very tight and twisty circuit. So definitely a heavy influence on downforce will be. A lot of attention will be given to downforce as we race through this circuit. So it'll be interesting to see how drivers find the right balance for their cars. Also, something Singapore is renowned for is rain, so we will have to see if there's any rain to be predicted in this race. We haven't had a wet race just as yet, so everything to play for here as we're all set to get qualifying underway. It'll be interesting to see who will be the car to go out first and set out some rubber out on track. Obviously, at the start of the qualifying session, there's never as much grip because there's not many cars. There's been no cars that have gone on track at the moment, but as the qualifying session progresses, I'm sure we'll get faster and faster lap times. All right, and we're all set to get qualifying underway as I quickly enable all the details so we can stay informed as to who's progressing throughout the lap. And who will be the first driver to set out of the pits? Nobody as yet as they start to load up their setup, set their tire pressures and everything. So, and it seems like we have a clear skies at the moment. We can see there's some activity in the Mercedes garage, the number 9 car, and we can see over there in the background the Ferrari driver, and I believe that is the Alpine driver that are going to be setting out on track at the moment. So First driver out on track at the moment will be Ishtar, so we'll ride on board with him and see how his first, and as hopefully he sets the first timed run of qualifying, and we'll ride on board with him to see a run through of how this track is. Really good idea to check who is behind him. We can see a Mercedes in the background. That seems to be Ella. I just want to make sure that I have the right people out. Okay, so we have Ishtar followed by Ella, followed by Steba. So, but of course our attention will remain on the Ferrari. Of course, Mitchell currently leading the championship. His teammate didn't have a fantastic race in the first opening race of the season. He'd be looking to definitely bounce back from that and maybe help his teammate in the battle for the constructors, or maybe even if he can fight his way back up into the drivers championship. Still in the second race of the season, 10 more races to go after this, so everything to definitely play for. It's not over yet. As we can see, Ishtar coming through the very tight and twisty section of the circuit. Very easy to clip that wall on your right there as you try to stick as much to the right as possible for a better run down this next straight. 2 DRS zones over here. Obviously the second DRS zone not entirely long, but we might be looking at a few overtakes heading into the next corner, assuming that anybody can get a very nice run heading into that corner. We get the beautiful still shot of the Ferrari coming through that chicane over there. Right, so let's ride on board with Ishtar as he begins the first timed run here at Singapore, sticking as much to the right as possible as he begins his timed run, heading into turn 1, that very fast left-right chicane. It's very easy to invalidate there. Probably best to ride over the curbs as much as he did, and stick it as much to the left as possible, heading towards the first DRS zone of this track. It's a relatively long DRS zone, at least the first one, and you can see the flaps open now. Coming towards the end of Sector 1. What time will he set? Manages to set a 27.2. And we already have a yellow flag in Sector 1. That seemed to be the McLaren. If I want to say maybe... Is that Jacko? Yeah, it is. And almost every driver out on track at this current moment. Another thing that you have to worry about here is traffic. Obviously, there's not a whole lot of room in some parts of the circuit to go too wide in. So drivers are going to have to look for some way or the other to get out of the way of other drivers as to not obstruct their qualifying laps. Regardless, Ishtar coming towards the end of the Sector 2 sets a 105.0. Obviously, a purple Sector 1 and 2, but that being because he's the first car out on track at this current moment. Keeping it very nice and tidy as it comes through Sector 3. There's also a very tight pit entry, something to be very careful of, especially during the race. And now, Ishtar setting the first timed lap of qualifying, manages to set a 138.3. How will other drivers combat? We can see Ella has unfortunately spun his car around. Not too sure what happened there with him as we look on board with Steba now as he comes through Sector 3. Coming through the final corner of this track. Will he be able to beat the time set by Ishtar? Yes, he will. Manages to beat it by a considerable margin, almost by a second. Sets a 137.4. And Nova in P3 manages to set a 138.8. Mitchell currently out on his out lap. We can see Elite and Typhos. I'm so sorry, I asked him how to pronounce his name and I still messed it up, but Typhos and Elite still currently P4 and P5, and BR4 seemingly out of nowhere sets the provisional pole lap with a 137.4, just barely edging out Steba by roughly 0.003 of a second. Looking down the grid, Joe Royal currently on his run as well. We can see Stell right in front of him, comes across the line, sets a 137.1 and manages to steal provisional pole from BR4. What about Joe? Joe now comes across the line. Unfortunately, it doesn't seem like it's an incredibly fast lap time, as he sets a 205.0, so massively off the pace. And Bambino, who is currently second in the standings, manages to set a 131.1, now beating out Stell by roughly 500ths of a second. So a very tight grid we can see here, especially the battle for provisional pole. Meanwhile, Mitchell is currently now started his timed run. He is your championship leader in this championship so far after the first race of the season. Obviously a two-time champion with ALR. How will he bounce back? Coming through Sector 1 with DRS wide open as he approaches the end of Sector 1. Let's see what he manages to set. Sets a 26.7. No purple sectors for him. As we have continuous yellow flags, the drivers slow down to try to form gaps to the cars in front of them, as most of them are now, I'm going to assume, come back into the pits, as I can't imagine that their tires are really are probably too worn out to make a second run. Keeping it very nice and tidy to the left there with the DRS now wide open down this extremely short straight. He does have a car in front of him. It does seem to be a Williams, and that Williams driver will, unless Mitchell manages to catch up to him, that Williams driver will most likely have to get out of the way. This would not obstruct the Ferrari's qualifying lap. On this occasion, it doesn't look like Mitchell's really going to catch up to him. And Joe Royal actually manages to take provisional pole with a 137.0, 1/10 faster than Big Bambino. But will that stick as Mitchell now comes across the final corner of the circuit? And what time will he set? He manages to set a 136.4 and goes 6/10 faster than Joe Royal, managing to take provisional pole. And that, ladies and gentlemen, will be the end of your first few timed runs here at Singapore. We see drivers like Isher now preparing to go for their second runs, as a few of the drivers are now on their out laps. It seems at this current moment, Ella is most likely going to be beginning his for his first timed run. Cool! Completely loses the car there, possibly because he went on the curbs a bit too much, or maybe went on the gas too quickly. He completely lost the rear end of the car there, and has unfortunately most likely going to have to... Oh, he's gotten disqualified from the session in an attempt to straighten out his car. Unfortunately, Ella has been disqualified from the session, so I doubt he's going to be setting it. Yeah, of course he's not going to be setting any lap time, so he most likely will be starting from P15. Very unfortunate for Ella there. Bringing our attention towards the Haas, who's currently in P14. He's now on his out lap. Coming towards the end of Sector 1. Sets a 27.0, a purple Sector 1. We have another yellow flag in Sector 2 and 3 as there's there's another Haas and two Ferraris all bunched up together. Hello Saeed, good to see you as always. Thank you for tuning in. Jaguar having everything to play for at the moment. Currently P14, no time lap set. Luckily for him, he has managed to avoid most of the traffic as they've now just come out of the pits and now have begun their out laps. But as I say that, the Haas does have an Alpine right in front of him. Or what I'd like to assume is an Alpine. Yeah, it is. So Jaguar now, without a time set, comes across the final corner of this track, manages to set himself a 138.1, so nothing competitive as yet. Still sitting P10. We have another yellow flag in Sector 2 and 3, and it seems to be the Mercedes of Stell. Looks like that incident has been cleared up. We can go down and see Adam now beginning his timed run. Still currently without a lap time is Adam. Maybe had some difficulties in his first few runs. Maybe he had spun out and overcooked his tires a little bit. But now he seems to be on pace to set a lap time for himself. Unfortunately, Bambino has invalidated his second timed run, as well as Stell. BR4 has just freshly begun his run. Steba is currently coming halfway through Sector 2. Jacko has just finished up Sector 1. Typos has actually just begun his run as well. Ishtar roughly 4/10 up on his time. I didn't even realize. Coming through the final corner of this track, currently P11 with a 138.3. Comes across the line, sets a 137.7, so still nothing competitive from him just as yet. Roughly 1.3 seconds off his teammate. He's going to need to step up that pace if he wants to assist Paul House in the battle for the constructors. We can see Elite in the Aston Martin roughly a tenth up on his time. Assuming that he has a lot, I'm going to assume that he has a lot more time to gain through the final sector. Usually it's the final sector of the track where the most time can be gained. It's such tight and twisty corners that you have to really make sure that your racing line is spot on, otherwise you will lose out on so much time. Meanwhile, Mitchell still roughly 6/10 above everybody else. And as we ride on board with Elite, as he comes across the final corner of the track, what time will he set? Will he improve from P8? Manages to set himself a 136.7, has improved by roughly 8/10, and has jumped up to P2. A fantastic lap from him, and now that puts him roughly 3/10 off of provisional pole. You can see Bambino on the other hand, after invalidating his first run, I believe he's most likely going to complete the second run of his. And yes, he is. Does not dart into the pits, comes across the final corner, and manages to set himself a 136.7 and manages to promote himself up into P3. BR4 does not seem to be on a run of his own at the moment. Roughly, and Steba, not to mention, also roughly 2/10 up on his time. Now Steba comes across the final corner of this track, manages to set himself a 137.0, manages to promote himself up into P4. Still, nobody really too close to Mitchell. Mitchell seemingly in a league of his own, as he's roughly 6/hundredths down on his current lap time. Maybe he may have some time to gain in the final sector. We will have to see. So Mitchell's already set a pretty far out lap time from everybody else. Assuming that he improves here, I doubt anybody is really going to be battling him for provisional pole, and everything else will be there to play for. And as I say that, Mitchell now comes across the final corner of this track. He's had a 136.4 before, managed to set a 136.1, so I was correct. All the time to gain in the final sector of the track, and is now roughly a second above everybody else, and that brings the end of the second runs these drivers had in store for themselves. So at the current moment, we are over halfway through qualifying. Mitchell currently sitting in provisional pole with a 136.1. Joe Royal sitting in actually Joe Royal was very close to Mitchell. I did not see that coming. So Joe Royal in the Haas, roughly, I want to say 2/100ths of a second off of Paul House. Meanwhile, Elite in P3 in the Aston Martin with a 136.7 has very closely followed behind by Bambino, who sits with a 136.741. So the top two in a world of their own, P3 and P4 in a world of their own. And with the second runs of qualifying, apologies, when the second runs of qualifying now over, we can see Stella, oh, wow, okay, just massively cutting across turn one there. Three minutes to go in this session. It is a very long lap time here. And now, with 2 minutes 40 seconds left on the clock, every other driver not coming out at the moment. We can see Ishtar is currently out, goes 5/10 faster on his, actually, never mind, does not go 5/10 faster, seemingly has just begun his timed run. So currently P10, would definitely want to improve on this occasion. too far down the grid order he is. And only 2 more drivers that are looking like they're coming out for another outlap. It seems like Jack in P8 in the McLaren and Bambino in P4, and the Williams is coming out, getting out of the way for the Ferrari of Ishtar, as he's roughly a 10th up on his current lap time. Ooh, looked like he lost the rear there for just a little bit, but managed to keep the car straight up on track. Coming towards the second DRS zone with DRS wide open in the end of Sector 2. How much faster is Ishtar going? He's roughly 3/10 up on his time. Being 3/10 up won't promote him too far up, but as we saw earlier with Mitchell, Sector 3 is the track to gain the most amount of time, and almost every other driver now out on their outlaps. So this will most likely be the final run for Ishtar as he comes through Sector 3. And coming through the final corner, what time will Ishtar set? Manages to set a 137.3, improves by roughly 4/10, and unfortunately for him, that doesn't look like it's going to be good enough to put him in the top 5. And unfortunately for Ishtar, that seems like it's most likely going to be the end of his run, as Bambino is extremely slow on his lap at the current moment. Pyro, on the other hand, also currently out on his outlap by the looks of it. Unfortunately, it looks like Elite has also invalidated his lap time. But with plenty of time left on the clock, roughly 30 seconds, he'll definitely be able to make it to the line and begin his timed run. Bambino, on the other hand, according to the sector data, was roughly 4/10 up on his time. Unbelievable. So Bambino is definitely a driver to keep an eye on, currently sitting in P4. Will Mitchell and Joe be able to make it to the line? Joe definitely does, but will Mitchell be able to make it to the line? And no, he won't. He won't be able to begin his final run. So it doesn't look like Mitchell is going to be improving on this occasion. So everything to fight for Joe as he... okay, never mind. I thought I saw Bambino completely spin out there. But now this is a great opportunity for Joe as he gets a chance to improve it, as there's a broken front wing out on track, and it looked like it belonged towards the Aston Martin of... I want to say... Who was it? I can't really tell. Regardless, let us right on board with Joe. He's currently in P2. Everything to play for. And keep my eyes on Bambino as well, who's roughly 1.5 up on his lap time. Unfortunately for Mitchell, it doesn't seem like... It seemed like him not being able to make it towards the line is going to cost him as we're coming towards the end of qualifying. Ishtar has now retired from the session as we watch Elite coming through Sector 3. What time is he going to set? Bambino unfortunately does not improve and manages to stay P3. But the Aston Martin of Elite now coming through the final corner of this track. What time will he set? Manages to set a 136.2. It doesn't look like it'll be good enough to challenge Mitchell. And Mitchell's still staying in provisional pole position, but it's not over just as yet. As Joe Royal now coming through Sector 3 and unfortunately drives straight into the wall there. That is going to heavily cost him by the looks of it. And we'll have to see if he manages to even improve coming through the final corner of this track. Will Joe be able to take away provisional pole from Mitchell? And it doesn't seem like he will be able to. Unfortunately, that collision in the wall there costed Joe. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, Mitchell, for the second time in this season, manages to take pole position. Joe Royal in the Haas sitting in P2. Elite in the Aston Martin sitting in P3. We have Bambino in the Williams in P4. And Staba in the Alpine sitting in P5. What an interesting qualifying that was. Extremely tight racing from every one of the drivers, and we can see Mitchell for the second time of the season managing to take pole position by roughly 0.02 of a second. And to be fair to Elite, he wasn't extremely far off either. Roughly he was within 100th, so safe to say Mitchell is definitely not going to have this, is definitely going to have his work cut out for him. Heading into turn 1, it'll be interesting to see who comes out on top. Right, then 30 seconds or roughly 20 now until we get the formation lap underway. We're going to be riding on board with Mitchell, of course, as he runs us through the formation lap and bunches up the rest of the grid near the end. Hopefully hopefully he won't have to sit on his starting grid position for too long as his tires cool off. But it'll give us a good chance to take a look at what tires most of the drivers are going to be opting to put on for this race. And the formation lap is now underway. Let's take a look at the tires. So Mitchell at this current moment is running the medium tires. We can see P2 and P3 all opting to use, both of them opting to use the hards. Meanwhile, Bambino and Staba in P4 and P5 opting to use the mediums. So it's a big mix-up between mediums and hards. So there's no real general consensus of what's the better tire to be on. We obviously have a majority of more medium runners, as we can see for the hard runners, lap 18 to 25 being the predicted pit stop strategy. So who's going to undercut who? How will the safety car play into this? It's all to play for in this race, and all these things have to come into account. Since Joe and Elite are on the hards, you would imagine that Mitchell is definitely going to get off to a very fast start compared to P2 and P3, but of course, we've seen different circumstances prove otherwise. You never really know with tier racing, as Mitchell is not wasting any time in trying to complete his formation lap as soon as possible, really. Might want to slow it down through Sector 3 as he allows the rest of the grid to bunch up towards him. As unfortunately Jaguar has been disqualified from the formation lap along with Stell. This is that bunching up we were talking about. Mitchell not going extreme. Oh, driving into the wall there on the right. Luckily for him, I don't think damage is enabled during the formation lap, so he gets away a bit lucky there. Maybe going to have to be a bit more careful on his formation lap next time, as Mitchell now slowly goes towards his starting grid slot, and the rest of the car is weaving left and right, trying desperately to get some temperatures into their tires. And as the car gets, as the final car, it seemed to be Nova, gets into their final grid slot, we're all set to get the Singapore Grand Prix underway. It is the second race of the season, so the championship fight is still definitely on. We've got 4 or 5 red lights. It's lights out and away we go here for the Singapore Grand Prix. And no surprises there with Mitchell on the better tire compounds, manages to get a better run. But Joe Royal with the hards going down the inside into turn 1. Unfortunately, luckily for the drivers, there's no contact as there's been a massive spin in the background there. And we have a big yellow flag as it seemed to be Bambino who's dropped down all the way from P4 all the way down into P14. Luckily for us, we have no safety car or VSE just as yet. But meanwhile, Mitchell actually gets overtaken by Royal heading into the next corner, and now Joe is now leading the race. But Mitchell not done with him just as yet, heading around the outside into the next corner outside past the DRS zone. Goes a little off track there, but that unfortunately costs Mitchell just slightly, and Joe manages to retain the position. Looking down the grid, we can see the Mercedes, AlphaTauri, and Aston Martin of Pyro, Jack, and Typos coming very close together. No overtakes just as yet as Ella manages to get past Jaguar and manages to take P11. But it's still been relatively clean driving. We have no yellow flags in any of the sectors just as yet, but I don't want to commentate and I don't want to give a curse to any of the drivers just as yet. Looking a bit down the grid, we can see Ishtar now coming into very close contact there with Elite. Elite having some very strong defending there, but manages to cover off the move by Ishtar and manages to retain P4. And now drivers slowly beginning to form gaps towards each other. Obviously no DRS on the first 3 laps, so drivers are going to have to try to rely on their batteries and the slipstream if they're looking to make any sort of overtakes. Credit to Pyro, who's jumped up to P6 as a matter of fact. And at the end of the first lap, it seems to be Joe who's leading this race. Paul House unfortunately drops down into P2. We can see Jack managing to get past Pyro. And as I say that, Pyro's unfortunately spun his car around after getting a fantastic start and jumping up into P6. He unfortunately drops down into P15. And after that first lap, it seems to be Ella who's the closest to any of the other cars at the moment, roughly 2.5 tenths off of Adam, who is in the McLaren. And as I say that, they're now side by side heading through the DRS zone. Obviously, once again, no DRS, and Ella looking to dive around the outside, but unfortunately can't do anything just as yet. Thought about maybe making the switchback, and maybe will be trying to, but Adam in the McLaren manages to cover off that exit very, very nicely, and both the Mercedes are getting forced into each other by the looks of it. Meanwhile, as we look up the grid, Ishtar very close behind Elite. This is for the final podium position. And unfortunately for Ishtar, it just seems like he's continuously dropping off ever so slightly from the Aston Martin, but heading through the second DRS zone, assuming that he uses a bit of his battery, he's still too far back to make any sort of dives on down the inside at this current moment. And Ella not done with Adam just as yet. 3 tenths separating the Mercedes and the McLaren driver. Looking up the grid, we can see Mitchell has actually managed to gain back a bit of time on Joe. We saw the gap was roughly 5 tenths, and as I say that, it's gone back up to 5 tenths as Mitchell manages to set the fastest lap time of this race with a 1:42.2. 4 tenths separating P1 and P2. And Mitchell looks poised to make that overtake as soon as possible. Heading into the DRS zone. Will Mitchell be able to overtake him? And already 3 laps into this race, we can see Ella has unfortunately gotten the first time penalty of this race. DRS wide open, and it doesn't look like Mitchell has just enough top speed to catch up to Joe on this occasion. Is once again going to have to stick into the slipstream of him throughout the entire lap unless Joe manages to make a big mistake there. Shades of Brazil as we see P1 and P2 sticking neck and neck with each other. And unfortunately, Ishtar's left the session there. So I'm not too sure what happened. It looked like Ishtar is unfortunately disconnected. It's unfortunate for him as he was sitting in P4, a very, very promising position for him. And it seemed like he was gaining on Elite as well. So that's unfortunate. Hopefully he's able to join back and continue racing with us. As I look down the grid, Steva roughly 2 tenths behind Bambino and gets a very nice run out of that corner. But unfortunately, Bambino covers that exit off very, very nicely. And Steva has no choice but to allow his DRS flap to open up, and unfortunately he's still too far back on this occasion to make the dive down the inside on the Williams driver. BR4 on the other hand, getting past the ghosted car of Ishtar, as Ishtar thankfully managed to join back in this race, but is it a bit too late as now BR4 manages to get past Ishtar and goes up into P4. Joe now setting the fastest lap of this race with a 1:42.0. And we can see Ishtar with the DRS wide open, diving down the inside of BR4. Both drivers going side by side with each other. And Ishtar still ghosted by the looks of it. We can see Adam and Ella came into their own little battle over there. And Ella going extremely long, around the long way around the outside. Still can't get the move done. He's been trying to build this move up for the last few laps. Now Ella with DRS wide open. trying to get past the McLaren, and it seems like he's going to be able to, going down the inside line. Adam trying to tuck back into the slipstream to look for a possible overtake right back on him, but it won't be enough. Ella manages to finally get past Adam after this overtake was building for the last 4 laps. This track having one of the longest lap times on the calendar, I would say arguably the longest. And for 31 laps, it's definitely a test of endurance for some of these drivers. It's never easy to race for so long and be focused, mentally headstrong for so long. So it'll be interesting to see which driver comes out on top, as we can see Pyro getting very close behind Jaguar there. And with DRS wide open, he's right behind him, but it doesn't, once again, the straight just seems a bit too short. It doesn't seem like it's long enough for any driver to really make a move down the inside or the outside. And as I say that, Pyro is most likely going to have to tuck right back into the slipstream of the Haas in front of him. Meanwhile, Mitchell, 4 tenths separating him and Joe. DRS wide open once again. Mitchell once again setting the fastest lap time of the race with a 1:42.0, but once again too far back on this occasion. But obviously with the second DRS zone approaching, you would ideally want to be within 4 tenths, and he is roughly 3 tenths separating him and Joe. DRS wide open once again for Mitchell, as he thought about maybe diving down the inside, but thinks better of it, realizing he's a bit too far back and wanting to avoid the collision between the drivers, decides to back off. And this continuous battle between Joe and Mitchell is allowing Elite to actually catch up to them. So we can see a bit of a DRS train now forming between P1 to P3, as Nova now sets the fastest lap time of this race. 1:41.5, very impressive. Oh, looking down the grid, we can see Adam, Steba, and Stel very close together, and it seems like Steba is going to be trying to make the move. Oh, backs out of it on the very last second there. That was a smart decision from Steba to back out, deciding not to cause a collision between the drivers. Sensible racing from him, but Adam, on the other hand, decides to dive down the inside, and unfortunately, that costs him dearly as both Adam and Ella spin out. And unfortunately for Adam, he's lost out on a few positions there. Steva manages to get promoted up into P9. Very unfortunate for Ella there. I'm not too sure if he's experienced any wing damage. Doesn't seem to be the case, but he is definitely not going to be happy about that, and we're most likely going to be seeing a report about this in the steward's office. Jaguar getting a 5-second penalty for ignoring yellow flags. But the person who has a big headache on his shoulders right now is probably BR4, 3 seconds separating him from P3, and he's got a bunch of cars closing in on him. Already Ishtar and Jacko within his DRS range. And with DRS wide open, will Ishtar or Jack be able to make any moves on each other? It doesn't seem to be the case. So they go another lap without overtaking each other. Meanwhile, Pyro, on the other hand, roughly 4 tenths separating him and Jaguar. Another move that's been building for a considerable amount of time. We can see Pyro now diving down the inside of Jaguar. Both drivers going side by side heading into the next corner. But it looks like Jaguar with the outside line is going to try to defend this position. Both drivers still side by side heading into the next corner. And with the inside line this time around, Jaguar manages to retain the position, compromising Pyro there slightly, as Ella seemed to get very interested in making the overtake. And it seems like Jaguar has unfortunately gone a bit wide there. And now Pyro down the inside manages to make the move and overtakes the Haas driver. The Haas driver now coming into a battle of his own with the Mercedes of Ella. And Pyro slowly beginning to pull away. We can see Jaguar has a massive headache of having to overtake Pyro and defend from Ella at the same time. This is the exact corner where Ella lost his car earlier. And we can see once again shades of him spinning out as he loses the rears very slightly. Thankfully for him, he doesn't lose control of his car, but he does lose out to a bit of time to the Haas in front of him. Steba, on the other hand, 2 tenths separating him and Stel. It seems like from this camera angle, Steba is basically just pushing the Mercedes of Stel along, sticking right towards his diffuser. And coming down the start-finish straight. Unfortunately, that gap has increased very slightly to 5 tenths. And due to that gap increasing, it doesn't look like Steva is going to be making any sort of moves just as yet, but he would like to catch up to him through these tight chicane, heading into the next DRS zone. We do have a yellow flag in Sector 1 at the moment. It's thankfully been cleared. And that headache we were talking about for BR4, having to defend from the cars behind him, they're just getting closer and closer as the gap from for BR4 to Elite increases significantly, now dropping down to roughly 4.7 seconds. But with 5 tenths separating the Ferrari and the Red Bull and the McLaren, once again the straight just seems to be too short to make any overtakes. It is lap 7 to 31. We know lap 18 is the expected pit window for the hards. And it seems to be at this current stage, looking at the grid, the medium runners have all dropped. A considerable amount of the medium runners have all dropped down towards the bottom half of the grid. So the hard runners definitely seemingly having the better tire compounds. We can see Isher, it seemed like he was just having some internet issues there, was going completely sideways at one point. And Stell, unfortunately, it looks like Stell has completely spun his car around. No wing damage for him once again as he manages to avoid that. But unfortunately for Stell, after the promising position he was in, it goes down into P14. So he's obviously going to be kicking with it for himself for that. And it seems like Isher has had a moment of his own as he loses out 1.2 seconds to BR4. Meanwhile, Mitchell, 2 tenths, 1.5 tenths now separating him and Joe. That DRS zone was very promising for the Ferrari driver. But once again, Joe managing to cover off the exits and not allowing Mitchell to catch up to him, as Jaguar once again picks up a 3-second time penalty. Tons of battles taking place at once, as we can see Ella pushing the Haas of Jaguar along, and it seems like he was nearly successful in doing so. Thought about maybe making a dive around the outside, and unfortunately Ella has spun his car around, going on the gas a bit too quickly there. There was no contact for him in any other car, and unfortunately Ella has lost his car. Both the Mercedes drivers seemingly struggling significantly in this race. It might be because of a very similar setup that these both drivers are sharing with each other. But it seems like the Mercedes is having a terrible time in this race, as it's only lap 8 of 31. And as we were talking about earlier with this battle of Mitchell and Joe allowing Elite to catch up, we can see now Elite roughly 3.5 tenths behind Mitchell. And this is not what the Ferrari driver would have wanted. But luckily for him, his saving grace is still being within the DRS range of Joe. Pyro once again very close behind Bambino. This is for P10 for the final points position on this grid. And with DRS wide open, it doesn't look like it's going to be enough. Bambino probably using a bit of his battery to defend from the AlphaTauri driver. So no moves just as yet. But heading into the next DRS zone, a straight that is significantly longer. We can see Stell in the background getting very interested in maybe making a possible overtake on Jaguar. But at the moment, Pyro now going around the inside, going towards the inside line. Both drivers heading side by side into the next corner. With the inside line, Pyro manages to cover off the exit and gets the move done very nicely there. So fantastic overtake from him, and now we can see the Mercedes of Stell and Jaguar going side by side with each other. And in this exchange, Jaguar comes out on top and manages to stay in P12. Overtakes left, right, and center. Seems like every car on the grid is having to worry about something or the other. As we once again see Elite getting very close to Mitchell, and Mitchell seemingly dropping off from Joe, possibly because of the wear and tear on his medium tire compounds. Obviously, we know with the hards they're going to last longer. So Mitchell now may be possibly experiencing a loss of grip on lap 10. Mitchell trying desperately to stay within the DRS range of Joe. If he gets out of that, then he knows that he's going to have to massively use up his battery, which he would he would prefer not to use to defend from Elite. But luckily for him on this occasion, he does manage to stay in front of him and retain P2. Jacko getting very close to BR4 once again. Stell and Jaguar once again going at each other, and now Stell going towards the inside line. Thought about maybe diving down the inside, but thought better of it. Backs out into heading into the next corner. Maybe trying to get a better run heading out of this corner, and no, it doesn't seem like it's good enough on this occasion. Jaguar managing to retain P12. It's only lap 10 of 31. We still have 21 more laps to go. And most of these drivers realizing that it is a marathon. Well, I say it's a marathon and not a race, but it is technically a race. But with a race that's this long, you really have to be patient and bide your time. You don't want to do anything risky or foolish that would cost you significant amounts of time or possibly positions. So sometimes it's just better to back off and just wait until the next lap. And surprisingly, it seems like Ishtar has now come into the pits. I'm not too sure why, and it does seem to be a wing change as well for him. So Ishtar must have had a moment of his own where he must have damaged his front wing. And now coming into the pits becomes the first driver to have come in after the first few laps and change off of his compounded tires as he switches onto the hards. I'm not too sure if those will go towards the end, but he can certainly hope and try. We still haven't had a safety car here yet. The closest battle on track at the moment seems to be for P1. Mitchell once again 8/10 off of Joe. And it doesn't look like he has the ability to really close that gap now, as his medium tires are definitely getting worn out. And as we ride on board with him, we can definitely see the wear and tear on his tires at this current stage. So lap 11 of 31, Mitchell and Jack being the only drivers at the current moment to have the medium tire compounds on in the top 5. We can see very few hard runners at the moment, as now Mitchell decides to come into the pits in lap 11 of 31. Decides his mediums have had enough pressure put on them, and now will come into the pits to most likely switch on to the hard tire compounds. That allows Elite to breathe a little bit as he now gets free air to catch up to Joe in front of him. And what kind of chain reaction will this cause? Will any other driver decide to come into the pits? Steva is now diving into the pits. Will Adam decide to follow suit? Yes, he will. So now it looks like the medium runners have had enough of their tires and now are coming into the pits to switch on to the hards. And Mitchell coming out of the pits now. Will he be able to maintain his position? Yes, he will. Comes out in P6. And we'll be going towards the end of the race from here. Most of the medium runners now switching off the mediums and onto the hards, as Mitchell is going to have to weave left and right to gain a little bit of temperatures onto his tires. We can see Pyro right behind him. Pyro, of course, on his 11-lap-old mediums will definitely be feeling the wear and tear on them. I wouldn't be surprised if he decides to come into the pits in this lap. And despite having Mitchell get out of his way, it seems like Elite still unable to get within the DRS range of Joe. We do have a yellow flag in Sector 2. Seems to be the Mercedes of Stell, as he's once again struggling on those tires of his. Those hard tires are definitely not helping him. Hopefully he manages to avoid wing damaging once again. Currently sitting in P9. And we see Jack in the top 4 now decides to come into the pits and switch off of his mediums. And with that early pit stop, Mitchell of course manages to overtake Jacko, now managing to promote himself up into P5. And everything to play here for Mitchell. He only has 4 drivers in front of him, all on old hards. So that tire advantage should come in handy. However, of course, the drivers in front do need to pit and switch on to their fresh mediums for the end of the race. It doesn't look like any drivers within the DRS range of each other, so we've got a bit of a chance to we have a bit of a breathing room essentially, as some of the drivers can take a few minutes to catch their breaths after that first, I want to say the first half of that battle, first half of this race. We can see Staba getting very close behind his teammate Nova, who is currently still on the 10-lap old mediums, and very surprisingly Pyro keeping out on track, still opting to use his 12-lap old mediums. Surely he's feeling the wear and tear in them now. He must have preserved his tires very well if he's managed to stay out for this long. And as I say that, now Pyro decides to call it quits and decides to go into the pits to finally switch off of his mediums and onto the hard tire compound. So a late pit stop from him. But obviously that would mean that out of all the medium runners who have come into the pits to switch onto their hards, Pyro is definitely going to be the one with the freshest tires at the moment. You see in the background there, Staba has gained massively on his Alpine teammate Nova. Nova should probably not fight this position too hard. That would probably just let Staba through. Doesn't seem sensible to hold up your teammate who has the fresher compound of tires, as it would just be wise and better team orders to get out of the way. But it doesn't seem like there's any team orders here at Alpine. Both drivers seemingly looking like they're having a fight of their own, as now Staba with DRS wide open manages to get the move done and gets past Nova. I'd say that move should have come a bit earlier, but in the end at least it came. And that promotes Staba up into P9 and Nova drops down into P10. Should be a matter of time before Nova decides to call it quits and move on to his hards as well. Looking up the grid, meanwhile Elite finally getting within that DRS range of Joe. And with DRS wide open, he does get the DRS wide open through the detection point. So it looks promising for the Aston Martin driver as he's trying to catch up to the Haas. We have another yellow flag in Sector 2. Oh, and it seemed like it was Staba. Oh, I'm not too sure what happened there. Staba, unfortunately, he had managed to get past his teammate. And it seems like we've had a full safety car. That's surprising. So that's something I don't think any of us realistically expected through that situation. We all knew that he unfortunately lost his car there, but to have a full-fledged safety car? But what does this mean for the hard runners? Lap 15 of 31. Their tires are 14 laps old. I would assume that you just come into the pits here and just move on to the mediums. Joe is going to be having to be the first driver to make that decision. We can see Ishtar and Jack have moved on to the medium tires. So what will Joe do? As he's coming through the second DRS range. He's still a bit far out, and we can see a bunch of drivers in the bottom half of the grid all opting to come into the pits and switch on to fresher compounds of tires, hopefully trying to go towards the end. It seems like the general consensus is to move on to the mediums, as most of the drivers feel like the last 16 laps. This plays greatly into the hands of the hard runners. And Joe opting to go straight into the pits and move on to the medium tire compounds, an optimally smart decision from him. So with the safety car, ladies and gentlemen, at the current stage, let's review your standings at the moment. So Joe Arroyo sitting in P1 right now with his hard tires is going to switch off of them and move on to the mediums. Elite and the Aston Martin in P2. We have BR4 and the Red Bull who's now coming to the pits in P3. We have Typos in P4 in the Aston Martin also opting to come into the pits. Possibly it's definitely going to be a double stack at Aston Martin. And Mitchell, this is the big question. He's also opting to come into the pits. So only his 3-lap-old hards. There's no point staying on them if the rest of the grid is just moving up into the mediums, and now has decided to come into the pits himself. And it seems like Jack is most likely going to be a bit too far back on this occasion to really gain anything on this move. So no switch arounds in the top 5 after they all come into the pits and switch on to the medium tire compounds. At this current stage, only 2 drivers are on the hards, and that is Pyro in P7 and Jaguar in P9 on his 3-lap-old hards. Unfortunate for these drivers. I feel like Pyro most definitely lost out on that situation the most, unfortunately, as he had just pit a lap before for the fresher tires. And now we can see apologies. And now we can see Joe right behind the safety car trying to bunch up the rest of the grid, which is unfortunately extremely spread out at this current moment, so we'll definitely have a few laps behind the safety car. So why not take a look at some interesting details at the moment. So let's see which driver has made up the most amount of positions. At the current stage, it seems to be a tie. Actually, it seems to be Typos, who's currently in P4, roughly up 5 positions. Staba, unfortunately, the driver who's lost out the most throughout this race, has dropped down 8 positions, currently in P13. So a few of the drivers definitely struggling here, as we can see Jaguar and Ella in P9 and P14 respectively, both having 3-second time penalties. We'll keep an eye on them at near the end of the race to see if they lose out on any positions, or if they manage to retain their positions, assuming that they can get enough of a gap. And we can see Nova is actually retired from the session so far down the grid and on his 2-lap-old hards. I can't seem to blame him for it. And unfortunately, that's the end of the Alpine driver. It seems like he stopped out on track at the moment as well. It could be that he just accidentally drove into the walls there. Obviously, it's difficult to get temperatures into your tires under the safety car conditions, so it's hard to really say. Well, we're now down to 14 drivers, laps 17 of 31. We are a bit over halfway through this race. it's lap 17 to 31. Obviously, the grid still hasn't bunched up together just as yet, so we'll most likely have one more lap behind the safety car. And looking at the grid at the moment, Mitchell has everything to fight for. Did manage to take pole position, but unfortunately, after the very late safety car, he does, well, halfway through the race, the safety car came out. Now, unfortunately for him, he sits in P5 with 4 other drivers in front of him, all on the equal tires that he is on. And with a track like Singapore, when how difficult it is to overtake here, especially it's even harder to go side by side with some of the drivers. We're gonna have to see if Mitchell has the speed to catch up to the front of the grid. So now then, it seems like the rest of the grid has managed to bunch up together. And as the safety car approaches the end of Sector 2, will the stewards give us the go-ahead that the safety car is coming in at the end of this lap? We'll have to see. Coming towards the end of Sector 2. And yes, race control has given us the update. The safety car is coming in at the end of this lap, so it's now up to Joe to bunch up the rest of the grid and go at a time that he deems best to catch Elite and BR4 off guard. We'll ride on board with the Haas driver to get a better idea of when he decides to go, as he's slowing down massively and weaving left and right to retain some tire temps. We can see Elite not leaving him any breathing room, looking to jump the gun as soon as Joe does. Ooh, getting very close behind the Haas driver there. As the safety car has now entered the pits, when will Joe decide to go? And now it seems like he has way before the final corner. And has he caught Elite off very slightly? It seems like he has, but may have gone a bit too early there, as that allows the Aston Martin driver to get a potential run towards him down the heading into turn 1. We can see Typos in the background there still struggling to get some temperatures into his tires as he sits in P4. And Joe getting that safety car restart done spot on as he retains P1 at the moment. Looking down the grid, we can see Mitchell getting very close behind the Aston Martin driver, trying to make a dive down the outside, around the outside, but can't do anything yet. Decides to go for the switchback, and now manages to get past the Aston Martin driver and promotes himself up into P4. But it's not over just as yet, as the Aston Martin driver, once again tucking into the slipstream, tries to go the long way around the outside, but gets forced off track, unfortunately, and manages to drop down into P5. So Mitchell manages to retain his position of P4. That move over there unfortunately looked like it costed the Aston Martin very slightly there, as he may be under attack from the cars behind him. See Isher 3 tenths behind Pyro at the moment. And Mitchell roughly 1.5 seconds off of P3. But Pyro in P7. 3.5 tenths behind Jack. Of course, there's no DRS straight after the safety car restart, so he's just going to have to stick right behind him and hope that Jack can make a mistake that he can capitalize on. And luckily for us, we've had a very clean safety car restart here from the drivers. Stable, on the other hand, thought about maybe diving down the inside of Stell, just showing himself off in his mirrors there to show Stell that he's still there, that he can't get too comfortable in the position that he's in. This is for the final points position of this race. Joe Royal manages to set the fastest lap time of this race to the 140.3. Oh, and Stebas unfortunately spun his car around, heading into the first corner, heading out of the last corner there. And unfortunately for Steba, he did drive into the wall there. I'm not too sure if he suffered from any significant wing damage, but unfortunately for Steba, he drops down into P13. Looking up the grid, Mitchell slowly gaining on BR4. Elite roughly 5 tenths behind Joe. But more importantly than anything else, still was roughly a tenth behind Jaguar, and Paul House manages to get a 3-second time penalty. It looks like, unfortunately for Mitchell, he drove over the curbs a bit too much there, and that's going to cost him heavily as he picks up a 3-second time penalty with 11 laps left to go in this race. Which driver is going to come out on top? It seems like BR4 is now managing to catch up to the Aston Martin of Elite, as now P1 to P4 all within the DRS range of each other. We have a small DRS train now forming for the lead of this race. Bambino now picks up a 5-second penalty for crossing the pit lane exit's white line. Still 3.5 tenths behind Jaguar. The Mercedes and the Haas drivers have been going at each other seemingly for the entire race. And it's no different here. Race control has now given us the update that DRS is now enabled as as Mitchell sets the fastest lap time of this race with a 1:39.8. And with DRS wide open, now the real fun begins as drivers in the top 4 are all within DRS range of each other. It seems like Joe may be a bit too far out to really be overtaken by anybody on this occasion. And obviously these drivers being within the DRS range of each other will have a very difficult time to catch up to one another. But it looks like for a driver who it won't be too difficult for is Ishtar, as he is roughly 4 tenths behind Pyro, who unfortunately does not have DRS, and still managing to make the move and getting past Jaguar on that straight. But it's not over for him just as yet, as Jaguar look towards diving down the inside but can't do anything yet. The Haas seemingly getting better runs out of the corners as compared to the Mercedes driver, but still managing to retain his position. We can see Mitchell roughly 3 tenths behind BR4, who's unfortunately dropped out of the DRS range. We have a yellow flag in Sector 3, and now in Sector 1 by the looks of it. But coming through that corner, Mitchell unfortunately just lost out on a bit of time and won't be able to make the move on the Red Bull driver of BR4. Ten laps to go in this race. Who is going to come out on top? We can see Adam and the McLaren getting very close behind Jaguar. We saw Jaguar unfortunately lose out a position to the Mercedes driver in front of him, and obviously with this penalty, he has enough headaches to deal with as it is. Looking up the grade, it didn't seem like Mitchell would be able to make the move heading down the start-finish straight. But now, roughly 3.5 tenths separating him and BR4. The Ferrari of Mitchell with DRS wide open, catching the Red Bull of BR4. Will it be enough to make it dive down the inside? He is very, very close. Looks towards the inside line. Thought about maybe diving it down, but decides better off it and backs out of that corner as Ella now picks up a 3-second time penalty. Very unfortunate for BR4 that he's dropped out of the DRS of Elite, as he has a massive headache behind him and a very, very quick driver. Elite doesn't seem like he's catching up to Joe on the other hand. But Mitchell now heading into the 3rd DRS zone of this track, a very, very short straight that we've seen hasn't yielded many fantastic overtakes in this race, and once again has failed to do so. So Mitchell once again stays in P4. Just waiting for the slightest mistake from BR4. Mitchell seemingly just pushing the Red Bull along, trying to force him into a mistake, but BR4 managing to retain his cool. As long as he can keep his composure up, he will be able to keep defending from Mitchell, but it doesn't seem like that's going to be the case heading into this turn 1, as Mitchell with DRS wide open heads towards the inside line, and with the inside line manages to make the overtake on the Red Bull driver and promotes himself up into P3. Now he's 1.7 seconds behind, and we can see Joe unfortunately had a moment there as he's lost out the position to Elite, It seems like Joe had a moment of his own, and now Elite in the Aston Martin now leads your race. This is great for Mitchell, as now it gives him a chance to catch up to the drivers in front of him. No DRS, unfortunately, as he may have not been within a second through the detection point. But what will this mean for Joe, who's unfortunately dropped down a position now, and now sees the Ferrari of Mitchell right behind him. Looking down the grid, we can see Adam and Jaguar both going side by side. There's a bit of wheel banging between the drivers, and unfortunately Jaguar had to go off of the track there and picks up a 3-second time penalty. So once again, Jaguar struggling massively with track limits. Let's take a look at how many penalties he has. He's rocking 6 seconds at the moment, and Adam, with a better run, thought about maybe diving down the inside, but thinks better of it, decides to back off on this occasion. We can see Stell, on the other hand, getting very close behind Ishtar. But Mitchell, with that 3-second penalty, will definitely have to pull away from some of these drivers if he's looking to retain any of his positions. Obviously, as things stand at the moment, if the race was to finish in the order that it is, BR4 would overtake Mitchell and take the final podium position. Now then, once again, heading towards turn 1, Joe Royal picks up his time penalty. And actually, Joe Royal picks up his first time penalty of this race, and this is a great situation for Elite to be in. Being in lap 24 of 31, but still without a time penalty at the moment. BR4 could benefit greatly from this, assuming that he can stick closely to Mitchell and Joe. And we can see Mitchell getting very close behind the Haas driver. Once again, this overtake was a long time coming, ever since lap 1. We saw Mitchell couldn't get the overtake done quite right at that moment, but now with DRS wide open and Mitchell and Joe outside of the DRS of the car in front of him, Mitchell dives down the inside and manages to make the move stick and promotes himself up into P2. And Adam, unfortunately, DNFs from this race. That's unfortunate for the McLaren driver. We don't have a safety car, thankfully. And unfortunately, after getting overtaken by Mitchell, now Joe has to worry about the Red Bull of BR4 right behind him. Mitchell now roughly 1.4 seconds away from Elite. He's going to have to gain a lot more time than that if he looks to retain P1 after his 3-second time penalty comes into effect. Looking down the grid, we can see Ishtar trying to catch up to Pyro, but he's just unable to at the moment. Esteban getting the fastest lap of the race with a 138.9. And once again, it seems like Joe has unfortunately dropped out of the DRS range of Mitchell. So with DRS wide open for BR4, unfortunately he's a bit too far back on this occasion. But assuming that he can stick right behind him through these tight, twisty sections, he may be looking to make another overtake heading into the second DRS zone. 500 separating Joe and BR4. And with DRS now wide open, BR4 can sense that the Haas is compromised as he closely gains on the Haas in front of him. Unfortunately, too far back on this occasion. Can't make the dive just as yet. Looking down the grid, Ishtar getting very close behind Pyro, but Pyro managing to hold his position. Maybe using a bit more battery than he would like to use, but that's the sacrifice you have to make. It seems like Mitchell's unable to catch up to Elite at the current moment. Lap 25 of 31 and 1.3 seconds separating the drivers. And speaking of not being able to catch up, we can see Joe struggling to catch up to Mitchell. Drop down to roughly 2 seconds of a gap there. I feel like the only real way you can ever see an overtake heading into that corner is if the driver in front of you has made a massive mistake coming out of the exit there. We have a yellow flag in Sector 3. Oh, right as I go on board with Elite, it seems like he got a bit squarely on the exit there. Maybe went on the gas a bit too quickly, and that allows Mitchell to gain a bit of time on him. Meanwhile, BR4 3/10 separating him and Joe, as Staba unfortunately DNFs from this race. We do have a yellow flag in Sector 1. Thankfully, no virtual safety car or safety car at the moment. I actually should switch off of this and go back onto the go onto the tires once again. We can see Ella has actually managed to pit for the fresh softs to go towards the end. He is 44 seconds behind Jaguar, unfortunately. Meanwhile, BR4 with DRS wide open, once again unable to make that overtake stick. And interestingly enough, we can see Mitchell has actually nearly come within a second of Elite. So granted, he keeps up the pace that he has, he may be able to catch him near the end of this race. The Red Bull pushing the Haas along towards the third DRS zone of this track. Only 5 more laps to go, and unfortunately we can see the blinking red light of BR4 signifying that he has less than 10% ERS. Just can't use his battery to catch up to him. BR4 may have been giving everything he's got to stay within the DRS range of Joe, or catch up to Joe as a matter of fact. And Stell now picks up a 3-second time penalty. So the nightmares for the Mercedes crew continue as he sits in P9 with another 3-second, well, I believe his second 3-second time penalty? No, it's his first. And BR4 once again, 4.5 tenths separating him and the Haas. And Mitchell, interestingly enough, was within a second for just a split second. But coming through the detection point, will he be able to get that DRS? We'll have to see. Coming through the DRS zone, he unfortunately does not have DRS on this occasion, just barely missing out there. But this is promising for him as he manages to slowly close the gap between him and P1. Ooh, Stell and the Ishtar going side by side with each other, heading into that corner over there. And Stell with DRS wide open will be looking to make an overtake on Ishtar. But Ishtar, using up his battery, most likely manages to retain the position and stays in P8. Only 4 more laps to go. Seems like Ishtar's actually dropped off from Pyro as a matter of fact. And now Jack, right behind Typos. 2.5 tenths, 3.5 tenths separating both the McLaren and the Aston Martin, and with DRS wide open. This straight is extremely short, but not short enough on this occasion. It seems like Jacko's going to dive down the inside of the Aston Martin. Both drivers going side by side, heading into Sector 3. Who's going to come out on top? And with the inside line, once again, Jacko's going to continue to try to fight back this position. But unfortunately for him, the Aston Martin of Typos manages to retain that position there and continues to stay in P5. With time winding down, there's only so much time. There's only so little drivers can do now, so it's either now or never for some of them. As we can see, Mitchell has now closed the gap to within a second, and he most likely will have DRS heading into the second DRS zone. And yes, he does. He does have DRS now. Bambino, unfortunately, getting a 3-second time penalty for corner cutting. And unfortunately for BR4, he would have loved to stick together with Mitchell, but is getting held up by the Haas driver. Oh, and actually, as a matter of fact, Typos and Jack going side by side with each other heading into this corner. And with the inside line, Typos manages to retain P5, but Jack's not done with him just as yet. Thinks about going around the long way, around the outside, but unfortunately just doesn't have enough grip to make that overtake stick. Now slipping back into the slipstream. He's unfortunately not gaining quick enough to maybe make another dive. And with that, Jack is going to stay in P6. Ella's unfortunately DNF from the race by the looks of it. Luckily for us, he has retired in the pits, so we won't have another safety car. Joe has been continuously defending for his life ever since the safety car restart. Obviously, he had that battle with Mitchell earlier, and now is in a constant battle with BR4. 3 laps left to go, and surprisingly, Joe's actually managing to hold his own in these current circumstances. Unfortunately, with that 3-second time penalty, assuming BR4 manages to stay in the same slot, it doesn't look like it's going to be enough. And unfortunately, it looks like Stell has actually lost his car once again. So the nightmares for the Mercedes team continues as Stell once again unfortunately loses his car and loses out of position to Jaguar and drops down into P10. Bambino going for the soft tires for a possible fastest lap of the race, trying to steal it away from anybody else. And we can see Jack now going towards the inside line of the Aston Martin. And with the inside line, dives and makes the overtake stick. And now finally, after the continuous build-up that we've seen for the last few laps, Jack manages to promote himself up into P5. With 2 laps left to go, 7 tenths separating P1 and P2. But of course, that 3-second penalty haunting Mitchell. Luckily for him, he has Joe Royal behind him, who has a time penalty of his own to deal with, plus the 6.5 second gap. I think it's safe to say Mitchell's going to need nothing short of a miracle here if he's looking to get past Elite. We are on the penultimate lap, lap 30 of 31. It's been a long and grueling race for some of these drivers. It's never easy to race a half race around Singapore, as Bambino once again gets another 3-second time penalty. It's very easy to make very, very small mistakes, but if you can keep your nose clean for a considerable portion of this race, you'll be looking for a significant amount of points. We started off with 15. We currently only have 11 drivers at the moment. We can see Stell now coming in to switch onto the soft tires to maybe go for the fastest lap. BR4, 4.5 tenths behind Joe. So the battle for P3, the battle for P1 continuing until the very last lap of this race. Bringing the gap down to 3.5 tenths at the moment. And with a lap to go, it'll be interesting to see if BR4 maybe has a trick up his sleeve. 5 tenths separating him and the Haas driver. Luckily for BR4, he knows that there's a time penalty ahead of him, so he may just decide to stick behind him and not go for the track position. He'd opt to just keep it relatively safe, and now, but we'll keep our attention on Mitchell. With DRS wide open on the final lap of this race, heading down the longest straight he has. He is unfortunately too far back on this occasion to make the overtake stick. Meanwhile, BR4 with DRS wide open, thinking about maybe making the move, and no, he's a bit too far back once again. Decides to stick right behind Joe for the remainder of this lap by the looks of it. And Bambino is unfortunately retired from the session. So now then, ladies and gentlemen, coming through the final few corners of this race, it's been a hard-fought battle between Mitchell and Elite. but it doesn't seem like Mitchell's going to be able to catch up to him. Ever since the safety cars restart, Elite has been absolutely on it, so a great race for him as he comes across the line and wins the Singapore Grand Prix. Mitchell, with it, despite having his time penalty, will finish in P2. Joe Royal, who has a time penalty, unfortunately will not be able to shake off BR4. Finishes in P3, but unfortunately drops down into P4 as BR4 gets promoted up into P3. Jacko, on the other hand, comes across the line, finishes up in P5. Typhus comes across the line and gets promoted up into P5 after Jack's penalty gets implemented. Pyro coming across the line, finishing in P7. Ishtar now coming across the line will be finishing in P8. And Jaguar and Stel now coming across the line, finishing in P9 and P10 respectively. And what a crazy long endurance of a race this has been. I think it's safe to say all the drivers need to take a bit of a break after that one. It was a fantastic race for most of these drivers. And a big congratulations goes towards Elite for winning the arguably one of the hardest races on the calendar. Right, so let's try to get a few of these drivers in for an interview. I'm not too sure if anybody will really join up, as I can't imagine they have the energy to, but if they do, then that would be fantastic. It is exhausting, this race. Hello, hello, once again, Mitchell. Congratulations on your P2, man.
I'll take it.
Yeah. I mean, you were telling me last week that you weren't a big fan of this track, but finishing P2, you can't be upset with that, man.
I am a big fan of this track. The complete opposite.
Oh, okay. Well, never mind. Then okay. Well,
But
you had quite the challenge on your hand, especially with the 3-second time penalty that you picked up near the end of the race. That was a tough race for you, wasn't it?
yes, it was. I don't know why, but the first thing I had absolutely no grip whatsoever. I think it was just, well, it doesn't make sense we're at night, but it was still cloudy.
Hmm.
So the temperature of the track was way down, and I had just no grip. I don't know how the guys on hard did it.
Yeah, it seemed like all the medium runners were really having an issue there because for the first half of the
Yeah.
race, it just seemed like all the medium runners dropped down and the hard runners had the better grip. But
And when I pitted to hard, oh, it was so much better. The lap I was on when the safety car was called out was like
yeah,
3 seconds faster than I was doing on my mediums.
of course,
But
yeah. No, but
that's unfortunate. Can
it must have
happen.
been difficult as well having to trying to catch up to Elite so late in the race as well with that 3-second time penalty. But
It was.
unfortunately, that's just how it is. But I can imagine how exhausted you must be. Singapore being one of those tracks that just kind of takes the life out of you by the time you're done with it.
Uh, yes, I am. Yes, I am. But it was good fun. It was good fun. I had to push, and well, I made a mistake, and this man, the winner, didn't. So
Yeah, well,
that's
hopefully
a
you
bit
can.
to him.
Yeah, I'm sure you'll be able to bounce back in the next race. But a big congratulations, regardless, for two consecutive podiums in a row. But I'll bring my
Thank you.
attention over to Elite. Elite, congratulations on winning your first race of the season, man. Tell me, how was it from your perspective?
Was good. Just a bit lucky that boys got fucked by a safety car, let's say. So,
No, for sure.
yeah.
I'm sure you were looking in your rearview mirrors the entire time through that race because this last quarter of the entire race, you guys were basically neck and neck with each other. But yeah, no,
I
after
had to
after that safety,
drain. I had to drain my ERS to pass the other guy, and I had no ERS left when I finally catched up to you. It's like, ah, shit.
no,
Couldn't do
I'm
much.
sure. But
Couldn't do
Elite, you got
much.
any memorable moments from this race? I'm sure you're exhausted, so gonna try not to hold you guys up for too long. So, but anything noteworthy throughout this race that you want to recall back to or anything?
Not really, actually. Just
Just happy you got done with it.
no. Yeah,
I can't blame you for
just
that.
lucky.
Well, you can't be upset with winning arguably one of the hardest tracks on this game. So big congratulations to you for winning this race, man. You definitely deserved it. But I won't hold
Thank
you
you.
guys up for longer. You guys can go relax to do as you guys please. I'll just bring it towards the
Thanks.
end for this. Yeah, that's just gonna be all we have in store for Tier 1 as we head down to, I believe it's going to be is it Monza or Imola that's next?
I wouldn't know.
Right. I'm
Don't
pretty
know.
sure it's okay. Well, yeah, it's Monza next, so exciting race for the next track. A considerably easier one as compared to Singapore, so I'm sure.
No, Singapore's better.
Really.
Yeah.
Alright, well, to each their own, I guess. I couldn't be asked to do Singapore for the life of me. Alright. That was Tier 1. I'll see you all next week for Monza.